On today's episode of Locked On Suns, 2 new targets, veterans minimum players who legit can help the Suns next season. Let's go.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And we're back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 6 seasons, a writer at Suns.com, and the host of the Just Basketball Show wherever you get your podcasts. A big thanks for making Locked On Suns your first listen. Happy Thursday. We're free and available everywhere, so if it's your first time finding this show, hit follow, hit subscribe wherever you are listening. We're on YouTube as well. Become an everydayer. Get locked onto the Phoenix Suns each and every day throughout the offseason and beyond. New rumors to get to, as well as the new collective bargaining agreement and some personal thoughts from me on a franchise icon. Let's dive in. Today's show is brought to you by PHX. Of course, first-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That's PrizePicks.com, promo code Locked On. Let's go. All right. 2 names, Kyle Lowry, Keita Bates-Diop. I'm actually looking to see if I can find my thoughts on Keita Bates-Diop from his draft, just to go in that memory lane. But I thought Wes Goldberg over at All You Can Heat, he has been on this show. He is also the host of Locked On Heat, but he wrote a good article breaking down the Kyle Lowry situation. So let's start with him. And mind you, I'm bringing these 2 guys up because they're new, because John Gambadoro and other reporters have linked the Suns to Keita for sure, and then definitely a lot of noise around Kyle Lowry. I know that Lowry, there was a fake report that Lowry had already been cut by Miami. That has not happened. That was a fake account. The @ on that user was King of Comedy. So, maybe check the @ if you're getting duped by something like that. But Lowry with the Heat. So Wes wrote in this article that Miami Herald, Miami Heat reporter, is saying that the Heat are considering stretching Kyle Lowry to get some cap relief. They could reduce their payroll about $20 million, which would get them below the tax. But obviously, with the waiving of a salary as big as Lowry's, you're looking at almost $10 million dead money on the books the next 3 years. So it is not an easy decision. But the real thing that is sort of lingering over this, 2 things that are lingering over this situation for the Heat. 1, the free agency of Gabe Vincent. We know he's in line for a raise. The question is, does a team swoop in and give him that raise and sort of force Miami's hand, or do the Heat go ahead and offer him a sizable increase on his salary to just go ahead and bring him back without much negotiation, without much of a market materializing? I would think, we did this exercise on the Just Basketball Show, and it seems like I was pretty close to accurate based on what you're seeing people guessing around for Vincent. I would say $8 to $10 million. So not to go too far down that rabbit hole, but that is where the Heat are. Bringing back Vincent, having some of their other talent like Jimmy, like Bam, who can handle the ball. There would just be no need to be paying 2 guys like starter or capable levels of point guard, and so Lowry becomes expendable. But obviously, even above and beyond all of that is the Damian Lillard question. It's unlikely, as far as everything looks now, that Lowry would be the big salary that goes to Portland in exchange for Lillard. It seems like that's more likely to be Tyler Hero, and so maybe there's a world in which the Lowry contract is sort of independent of Lillard, but we know in reality that's not how it's going to work. Even if Lowry's not in the trade, players are going to suddenly want to go to Miami. Lillard might have players he wants to play with. How are they going to use everything else on their roster? Does Vincent become expendable if they get Lowry? And so, if they get Lillard. So those are the dominoes that are going to happen here, which leads us to the reality that the Heat have until September 1st to stretch Kyle Lowry. The Damian Lillard situation seems like it'll at least take a bit before it finishes up, right? Because he's going to want to see what Portland does. Other teams might be in a wait-and-see mode. There might actually be not a ton of huge movement with the Lillard suitors or even with the whole market as a result. But either way, Portland is going to be in aggressive mode, and so we may see this linger. Regardless, the Suns are going to have roster spots if they want roster spots, right? I mean, even if they get some of their high-end, plan A, B, and C types of guys. I walked you through it the other day this week. Everydayers heard me. The Suns are still working with, even in a situation where they bring back almost everybody on their current roster that they're rumored to potentially keep. The Suns would still have about 5 roster spots open. And so, plus two-way contracts. Even if they give one of the 2 ways to Kamara, even if they give one of the roster spots to Kamara, they still have plenty. So this may be something, if Lowry eventually becomes available, if he is interested in Phoenix, if he accepts a minimum deal, I think he would be a great fit because they're not going to have to rely on him to do a ton. But at the same time, he showed in this past Heat playoff run that if what you're asking him to do is make hustle plays, make open shots, capably make good decisions with the ball in his hands, he can do that. He might even start on this team. Might be small minutes, but he would potentially start. That's a huge role. That is a championship caliber opportunity for Lowry. It just might not happen right away. Keita Bates-Diop. So I did find what I wrote about him in 2019 when he came out. 2018, which was my first year really diving in and covering the draft. Obviously, that was the DeAndre Ayton draft. Keita Bates-Diop. What I wrote, one line, I wasn't doing it as deeply as I did in 2019, but here's what I wrote. I said, I've soured a little as I've started to wonder about his NBA position, but I still feel solid that he'll contribute as a scorer. Setting aside that sentence is actually not grammatically correct. I should have said feel solidly, but you don't care about that. I was sort of right about the scoring part, but that was easy to see. He's an Ohio State guy who scored in college, had a big glow up from his freshman to sophomore year under a new head coach, and you felt pretty good about his ability to knock down shots at the NBA level. The question was, can he be a three-point shooter? Can he do other stuff on the court that makes him valuable, even if he does make threes? And the answer so far, I would say, has been yes to the first question and maybe to the second question. He made his threes last year. For whatever reason, something was in the water in San Antonio, and everybody had a career year shooting the ball, it feels like. Devontae Graham played well. Josh Richardson made a bunch of threes. He's somebody we've talked about as a minimum option for Phoenix, and so did Keita Bates-Diop. He made 56 of his 142 threes, which is good for 39%. And honestly, most importantly here, he has been a negative most of his seasons defensively. If you look at the all-in-one stats, I know that's not a foolproof method of measuring this stuff, but unless you want me to lie to you and pretend like I've been watching the Spurs or the Timberwolves, I'm going to just rely on those numbers for now. Yes, the defense has been negative. Up until last year, the offense was negative. But if you believe that there is something close to a neutral player in there and that the offense and the shooting are legit, you're talking about a guy who is already 27, but 6'8", and he redshirted, I think, a year. So he only played 2 years in college, but I believe he was actually in college for 3 years, so he was already fairly old when he came out, and obviously that was 6 seasons, so or 5 seasons now. So he's 27, but he's 6'8", can score, and if, again, you think he's a neutral defender, at the minimum, that's what we're talking about here. You're not going to get somebody who is a no-brainer positive rotation player unless they are old or something fluky happens. Most likely with these vets minimum guys, you're getting somebody like this. But you bet on the breakout last year being real. You bet on San Antonio moving on because of their roster crunch and everything else, and that he can come be in a winning situation at age 27 and potentially get an even bigger payday next year if he contributes for a championship contender versus, backing up Victor Wembanyama or whatever he might do over with the Spurs. I don't think it's a lock that he'll be available. Some team might throw a mini mid-level or biannual exception or some of these things at him just to get him a little over a minimum. But again, we know the appeal of Phoenix, and he is a good contender to have that appeal to him, to like the idea of, I've played a lot in this league, but I have not caught on anywhere. I can be a real bench player for a championship team, As long as I make my threes and compete on defense, let's see what that looks like. The new collective the new collective bargaining agreement came out on Wednesday, and a lot of it was already out there, but the draft pick situation for teams over the second apron of the luxury tax, like the Suns figured to be, caught my attention, and I don't think it's something that's quite gotten talked about enough. So let's talk about it and what it means for the Suns and how we've already seen them operate in the Beal and Durant trades. Coming up next, first, today's show brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks has fixed daily fantasy sports. I love Prize Picks. Here's the deal. You pick 2 to 6 players, and if they're going to score more or less than their Prize Picks player projection, that is it. No competing against other people. It's just you versus those projections. So let's say you love, in the women's game, you like the idea of Diana Taurasi to go more on points, and you like the idea of who's a great rebounder. I was going to say Brianna Jones. She just got her. Let's just go with Brittany Griner. More on rebounds. There's your lineup. That's it. No competing against other people. Just you versus those Prize Picks projection. And again, projections on any sport. I just said women's. NBA, you also have MLB going on right now. College sports starting up in not too long, as well as tennis, golf, and more during the summer. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less, safe and fast withdrawals, and currently operational in over 30 states, including Arizona, as well as Canada. So download the PrizePicks app now. Go to PrizePicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match with the promo code LOCKEDON. That instant deposit match up to $100, meaning if you deposit $100, PrizePicks matches that right back into your account. So don't forget to enter that promo code LOCKEDON and sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Shout out to Mike Vorkunov, who covers the business and sort of behind the scenes of the NBA, the stuff that doesn't get paid attention to a lot. Obviously, the CBA has gotten paid attention to, but he had a very good kind of FAQ over at The Athletic, which I highly recommend if you're a subscriber, just to get the lowdown. The whole document's like 700 pages. You don't want to read that, but Mike put together something very handy, and I was reading through it. Just because, obviously, the Suns are now going to be one of these second apron teams that are sort of experimenting around with what it is going to look like to have these punishments, these very punitive measures in place, and what are they going to have at their disposal? What are they not going to have? How can they make trades? What exceptions do they have? And on and on and on. But the draft part of it caught my attention, as I said. So let me read it to you. I'm going to summarize. I'm not reading it verbatim, but take my word for it. If a team is above the second apron on the last day of the regular season, starting with the 24-25 cap year, meaning July 21st, 2024, next year, then its first round pick 7 years out then cannot be traded. That is what's going to be called in the league now as called a frozen pick. If that team is also above the second apron in 2 of the next 4 years, that frozen pick will then also be moved to the end of the first round in that initial 7-year out draft. So with that 2024 example, which the Suns are almost a lock to be over this upcoming year, heading on to July 1st, unless something crazy happens, that draft would be 2031, right? If more than one team has a frozen pick in a draft year, then they'll draft in the reverse order of their finish in the standings in the season preceding that draft. So just like, any other league does it, everything outside of the lottery is done in the NBA. A team can unfreeze its pick if it is below or equal to the second apron threshold in at least 3 of the next 4 years after it went over. So think about it. Next season, the fall of 2024, that would start this period where if the Suns could somehow get under the second apron 3 of the next 4 years starting at that point, then they can unfreeze that pick. But obviously, if you think about how long that lasts, you're not getting the ability to have access once again to that pick until it's only a few years out at that point, right? So it gets frozen 7 years out, but you can't get access back to it until basically 3 years out. It will then be allowed to be traded again starting with the first day of the new salary cap year after that 3rd season of not going over the second apron. So it could be, I guess, 3 straight years, and then you wouldn't have to wait for the 4th year, or you wait for that 4th year and you're even closer to it. Got it? Does that make sense? Maybe not. Maybe it does. I think it's pretty as straightforward as it can possibly be. But that's not all. Well, this last part is just examples, and I was kind of giving those to you already. What does this mean for the Suns? What does this in practice mean? And let me start out by saying I know the Kevin Durant trade happened prior to the CBA. And I had somebody on Twitter, because I was just talking through the CBA stuff as it was out there on Twitter, and bored at work as we all get. And I put out there like this stuff is crazy. It feels like it's fixing a problem the NBA doesn't have, and all this stuff. And I'm not going to dig into the big picture of it in this 10-minute segment on a Suns show. There's plenty of coverage of this CBA out there, but I had somebody respond and say it is such a Suns luck type of thing for all of this to come together after the Suns finally get the biggest trade haul in the history of their franchise in Kevin Durant. Maybe you think Charles Barkley, but I would say Kevin Durant. And it's sort of true. But when you think of what happened in the series of unfortunate events, shout out to Lemony Snicket, the Suns traded all their crap for Durant, a bunch of picks, bunch of swaps, and then the CBA comes into effect, and this whole second apron stuff shows you how caught off guard I think a lot of teams were with this. But nevertheless, the Suns got the bad end of it, right? But this is another way in which the Bradley Beal trade makes more sense, right? The quote coming off of that from the Brian Windhorst article was exploding through the second apron, right? Exploding through it. And it's like a lot of people, I think, interpreted that as money. And it is clearly a dollars thing as well. I mean, it's not just these new rules, but even the luxury tax payment for the teams that are extra above that tax line, those go up too, the multipliers, the literal dollars that you're going to pay. And so it is about money, the exploding concept. But it's in some ways about getting ahead of these rules before they go into effect. And so that also happened with the way that the Suns were able to do this trade. Right? They took on more money. I believe they only ended up trading out 35 or so million, and Bradley Beal counted up until the next year. He was about 43 million for the salary of this past season, and that's what he counted as when the trade happened. So they took on an extra 8 or so million. That's not going to be allowed either, right? They're going to have to only be able to take back 110% of their outgoing salary in their upcoming trade starting on July 1st. And then after a certain point, I think it gets even more punitive to it has to be an exact 100% match or less. So that's another way. But this draft stuff is the final way that the exploding through the second apron really starts to make sense. The Suns knew when they traded the Durant picks, when they traded the picks for Durant, that they were out a bunch of picks, right? So there was a likelihood that the Suns were going to be over the second apron no matter what they did. That's part of what gets lost with the Beal analysis, right? Let's say the Suns traded Chris Paul to the Clippers for, it sounds like there's a package available from the Clippers of Powell and Morris, or maybe it would have been Powell and Covington or whatever. That would have been an equal or even potentially extra amount of salary on top of Chris Paul's money as well. Same thing could have potentially happened with DeAndre Ayton. We know that Shamet and Payne would have been trade candidates as well, in addition to the guys that the Suns are going to re-sign. So they might have gone above the second apron either way. You're seeing the Celtics get face down with that already. And so rather than keep their roster together and run the risk of those picks getting frozen because of that, with a roster of Powell and Covington and, whatever, Gary Harris, if they got him back for Shamet or whatever the moves would have been. I talked to you about a bunch of them if you're an everydayer, you remember. But now we have Bradley Beal on the team, so here in Phoenix. So it doesn't really matter what those would have been. But the point is, they were going to go over either way. They knew they didn't have a lot of their picks already. And so I think some of the thinking here was, let's blow through this rule about draft picks too. Let's give up the swaps. The second round picks, I don't think are affected here, but let's give it all up because most likely the track we're on, if I'm Matt Ishbia having my internal monologue here, the track we're on, we're going to have those picks frozen. We're going to be screwed as far as whether we can trade them and use them and where they land. They're all going to be at the end of the first round if we don't get out of the second apron quick enough and everything I just read to you. So let's give up the swaps. We got screwed on the Durant trade because we didn't know this was coming. Here we are. We know what the money situation is. We know what the pick situation is. And so it's just one more reason why going all in, exploding through that at second apron, as Windhorse wrote, just does make sense. Even though we all know the depth stuff is going to be a concern, I continue to believe there was not a better option available for Phoenix in order to make their team the best that it can be this upcoming season and beyond. I told you guys, and I promised myself, that I would carve out some space to talk about Chris Paul and his legacy here in Phoenix, so I want to do that now. I owe it to him. We all owe it to him to not let it slide by. And I know by August, no one's going to care. So I have a few minutes for you on why Chris Paul was key for development and relevance for the Phoenix Suns. We'll get into that next. First, a quick break. Coming back, free agency coming up, a lot going on, but got to talk about Chris Paul. It's funny because I didn't really do a show like this with the Durant trade because I think that I didn't want to rain on anybody's parade. I didn't want to rain on anybody's parade. Because it was Kevin Durant. The trade that I had been sitting here yelling about happening forever happened. And it happened to get the Suns, the best traded player in maybe league history. And so what reason would there have been for me to sit here and, get the waterworks going and be sappy about Mikal Bridges or Cam Johnson or anyone else? And there was plenty of coverage at the time about the meeting in the hotel room hallway that the team all had when they found out and how Monty was sleeping. And then Mikal breaks out, and I'm seeing people on League Pass every night in Phoenix watching Mikal Bridges. And I'm not going to make this about Mikal Bridges, but the point is, this is never easy, right? And so I didn't do one with the Durant deal, but you guys all know how I feel. If you're on YouTube, you literally see Mikal's jersey hanging up behind me. He's my favorite Sun of all time. But Chris Paul is up there. And I have an interesting relationship with Chris Paul, too, because Chris Paul is kind of what got me into the NBA. Not like into the NBA with lowercase I, like Steve Nash got me lowercase I into the NBA. I grew up. I'm only 26, so this was the Nash era was ages 7 through 14, 15 for me. I mean, those are formative years. I loved those teams like everybody, but I was a kid, right? Chris Paul gets to the Clippers in, I want to say 2013, 2012, that range, after Nash had left Phoenix, and I, had the bug a little bit, but Chris Paul became my favorite player. I just, the idea of the trade happening and all the drama around that got my attention, and then just, I liked Blake Griffin. I loved those two guys together. I was just intrigued by all of it, and obviously, LeBron goes to Miami around that same time, and the league was just kind of peak drama, peak competition, peak variety of team building and all that stuff at that time. It was kind of coming out of the weird mid-2000s run and post-Lakers Clippers, and it was Chris Paul's kind of era, right? And I loved him. I loved the Rockets teams as well. I loved the James Harden Rockets, and I know that's not a popular opinion. People think those guys ruin basketball and all this craziness. I loved watching those teams. And Chris Paul was there too. And so I almost couldn't believe it when Chris Paul got to the Suns. Like when the whole thing happened, I'll never forget. I just had started doing this podcast actually, again, when the Paul trade happened. I think it was my second week of doing this show solo when Paul got to Phoenix. And I had Trayvon Edwards, who does podcasting and stuff at at The Athletic, I had him on the show, one of my first shows, and he was like, look out for Chris Paul to Phoenix. Like, we knew he wanted to leave Oklahoma City. We knew there was going to be a trade, and the bubble had just happened and whatever. I was like, okay, like, I get you, but I don't really think, why would he do that? I mean, he's Chris MFing Paul, right? Phoenix, the Suns, 500 team, below 500 team, really? Come on. Then it happened. And it was like more than I could believe. Like, it was a weird thing too, because that was still when Zoom was happening for media stuff. So I didn't actually get to see Chris Paul because I also wasn't going to pay $100 and I wasn't going to get approved to be in that media brigade for the conference finals and the finals in 2021. A few people started to get into the room to do in-person media, but I wasn't one of them. So I didn't even see Chris Paul in person until basically training camp of the 2021-22 season for the first time. But still, I was like, so it kind of helped it not feel real. But I still, like, I just was like, he's on the team I cover, the team I grew up loving. He's on this team. My one of my favorite players ever, it happened to be on this team. That is crazy to me, and I'm covering it, you know? And so that's like me personally. Just to give you the background of where I've been coming from. Because I know that, like, look, I have to do this show every day. And if you are an everyday, or if you're somebody who's listened even just since the Durant deal or whatever, you've heard me be plenty critical of Chris Paul. The injuries are impossible to ignore. The kind of stubbornness when it comes to play style. I know he likes to say that that's not there, but we watched it for 3 years in Phoenix. When he's on the court, the team runs a certain way because of him. And there's room to criticize that. Not taking open threes, all the different stuff, right? But I just want to tell you that when I do it every day, it has to be critical a lot because there's a lot to be critical of. And maybe I'm too critical. But the point is, that's where I was coming from. And the experience of getting to have this guy here was incredibly positive. For me, for everybody watching, for all fans, like, this dude brought something different to this team that will never be forgotten. I mean, even if they had not made the finals, 64 wins, getting this team from the bubble to something better, real playoff experience. And so that's where I get to development and relevancy. Let's start with development. I don't think that DeAndre Ayton, Cam Johnson, or Mikal Bridges, or Cam Payne for that matter, get to where they have gotten to without Chris Paul. Ricky Rubio was plenty good enough for what the Suns needed at the time that they got him back in 2019. He was not going to turn Mikal Bridges into what Mikal Bridges became, feeding him open threes, encouraging him to take the ball in transition. You can hear on the broadcast cameras and microphones during some of those early Suns Chris Paul years prior to this past one, Chris Paul yelling at Mikal to take it, right? Attacking closeouts, all the different things, and off the court, being a leader and an empowerer of these young guys. Cam Johnson just getting open three after open three. Same thing with him in transition and him in the half court, handling the ball and everything else. Cam Payne has been maybe the most effusive about praising Chris Paul and just how learning next to him and watching him every day helped him at an insane level. I think Cam Payne in that Knicks game when Cam Johnson hit the game winner at the end of 2022 had 15 assists in the year that Chris Paul was out with that thumb injury that he tore. It's immeasurable. And then with Ayton, I mean, defensively, Ayton deserves a ton of credit for stepping it up, working with Mark Bryant, learning under Monty Williams, watching film, all the different stuff that needed to happen. But offensively, buying into a role, developing as an interior force, and growing his game out from the basics up. That does not happen without Chris Paul. Maybe they got tired of each other by the end. Maybe Ayton's tired of it. Maybe that's part of why you think he's going to improve this upcoming year is because Paul's gone. But the bottom line is it does not happen without him. That's development. Relevancy might be the most important part. It's one thing to get good players here, right? It's great. Awesome. It's another thing for it to be Chris Paul that comes here and that chooses to come here and that has success here, right? Because the Suns could have had another player come through who might have gotten them to 51 wins in the COVID year, might have even gotten them to the finals. I don't know, probably not, but Drew Holiday was around at that same time. Any number of guys. Kyrie Irving, once upon a time, we thought might be his son for in that Josh Jackson trade. He probably would have done quite a bit to improve this squad. There's a world in which they get to that level of competition with Booker and everybody else without Chris Paul. Other players can do the development part, even if Chris is maybe better at it. No one else, or very, very few players in the history of the NBA, bring the respectability and relevancy that Chris Paul brings. Him choosing to come here, him legitimizing what the Suns were building, him illustrating that having people who are plugged in and well-liked and well-respected around the league like James Jones and Devin Booker and Monty Williams, that matters and will matter forever, was huge. And just having somebody so entrenched in what the league is, a former president of the executive committee of the Players Association, one of the best players in the history of the game, somebody who's friends with the legends, the living legends of this era, and Wade and Melo and LeBron, that is just irreplaceable. I don't know if Kevin Durant wants to come here if Chris Paul never chooses to come here. I don't know if Bradley Beal ever wants to come here if Chris Paul doesn't choose to come here. And we don't know what's coming next, right? Maybe Frank Vogel doesn't. The domino effects are impossible to measure, but hugely important. And there will probably be more to come about how things went down. Maybe not. We don't know. Isaiah Thomas's name got dragged out there and everything else. I talked about how much of a bummer it is that it ended ugly. And it ended ugly on both sides. Both sides seem to be doing the other one wrong in some kind of way, and nobody's happy, and it is what it is. But you can't take away the fact that Chris Paul revolutionized this organization. Maybe Matt Ishbia never wants to buy this team if Chris Paul doesn't come. Again, I believe in Devin Booker. I think Mikal Bridges is somebody you bet on. I think DeAndre Ayton had more talent than what he showed under Igor Kokoshkov, and probably Monty Williams is going to continue to bring that out of him no matter what happened that offseason in 2020. But none of it happens to the degree and to the impact and to the level that it happened because of Chris Paul. So there's that. Salute to Chris Paul. Some of the best basketball watching moments of my entire life came with that man. I will never forget Game 6 of the Clippers series. He is a legend. He will be a Hall of Famer. I hope he gets his ring. Back tomorrow with one more free agency preview show. The trades should start soon, and Aaron Edwards will be here to close out the week. Well, there's going to be bonus shows, but close out the regularly scheduled programming tomorrow. So hit follow or subscribe wherever you're finding the show. We're free and available everywhere, including YouTube, and I will catch you with him tomorrow.